I think it's funny watching the religious try to defend the Bible by using absolutely nothing but double standards and misunderstanding what's actually going on. Of course, they have to, otherwise, their religion completely falls apart, but they seem entirely untroubled by it, mostly because I don't think they understand their own absurd failures. So let's do some more of that coming up next. We're going to check in on Erik Manning's Testify channel just for funsies, just to see if he's got anything intelligent to say. And don't be getting your hopes up. In fact, I think this is going to demonstrate one reason why I really don't spend a lot of time watching Testify videos because, Erik has problems. Most apologists do, but these are really obvious. He's treating his own credulity like it's a strength, and it's anything but. So let's go take a look and see what's what.
All right, so over the past dozen or so videos, we've been talking about undesigned coincidences in the New Testament.
Granted, we haven't seen your last, whatever number of videos, but this is a pretty common claim. It is, however, just a claim, since the religious are already looking for reasons to believe the things that they already believe, and therefore finding things in their silly books that sound convincing to them, even if they have to make it up on their own, that just gets them where they want to go, right? But just because you find a thing convincing, coming at it from your own personal perspective, that doesn't mean that I will, since I am not coming at it from the same perspective. And that's why they don't want to talk to us. They only want to talk to other people in their echo chambers who already believe on faith and won't ask too many difficult questions. I've said that many, many times before. Well, sorry, but I'm going to ask, because that's what rational people do. I don't think I'm going to be impressed by any of this, but I am open to having my mind changed. So go ahead, convince us. Let's at least give him the benefit of the doubt.
Let's switch gears and dive into the Old Testament now. Sure, the coincidences might not be as jam-packed as the ones of the New Testament, and they might not always have that cool factor of multiple accounts of the same event, but hey, there's still hiding some gems worth exploring. So let's dig in.
Now, as should be no surprise, I'm not going to look at this from the perspective of someone who already believes and really wants it to be true. I'm going to expect evidence that any of these things actually are. One thing that I was going to point out, but I was going to wait until it came up naturally in the course of the video, but hey, since we're doing the New Testament here, I guess I'll throw it in. But you have to remember that in actual reality, the people who wrote the Gospels weren't disciples and they weren't eyewitnesses. We know that they were written anonymously decades after the facts, the supposed facts, and we have no reason whatsoever to think that they ever knew Jesus, and lots of reasons to think otherwise. So before they wrote it down, it had decades to circulate among the people, and like any game of telephone, the stories get changed and refined, and details are added that were never part of the original event, and details that people didn't like, those kind of got edited out. That's probably where a lot of his details come from. But we don't know because individual verbal accounts leave behind no lasting evidence. If nobody writes it down, it just passes into history and then vanishes. Now, a lot of that is true of the Old Testament too, which will probably come up. But if you don't assume that everything in the Bible is historically factually true, that it's all actual historical accounts, which I don't and no one should, then I'm betting everything that he has to say is going to fall apart on any kind of critical evaluation. But I'm going to be fair here. Let's see.
Just as a quick heads up if you're new, undesigned coincidences happen when two or more parts of Scripture casually connect and often clarify each other. The casual way they do it is a sign of truth. The sources or passages don't seem to be making an effort to point to or complete each other.
Says who? This is just, well, it seems to me. But that doesn't mean anything. This is why I said that if you don't come at it from a specifically religious perspective, you're not going to see all of their undesigned coincidences like he sees here. This is just confirmation bias, nothing more. Going back to the New Testament, you have to remember that the anonymous authors of the Gospels, they had access to all of these stories that had been going around with the early believers. Other than Mark, the other gospel writers, whoever they were, they had access to the other books that came before theirs. In fact, the other gospel writers actively copied from earlier gospels, often verbatim. Then they made changes based on the story they wanted to tell to the audience they wanted to tell it to. Saying, well, they're all telling the same story, isn't impressive when you realize they were just cribbing off each other and the verbal tradition that had circulated for decades like a big game of telephone. That's not what Erik wants to believe, though, so of course he'll never bring that up.
This is not what we would anticipate from made-up stories or fake stuff.
Sure it is. It's not what we would expect from 4 independent accounts that were written by eyewitnesses, but that's not what we have. You have anonymous authors copying off each other and taking stories from the verbal background tales that believers had been telling each other for decades. This is exactly what we would expect when the author of Matthew takes a story from Mark and just adapts it for his own needs. Erik doesn't like that idea. So what?
However, it's precisely what we would expect from quite detailed and truthful accounts. Be sure to go back and check out the rest of the series to catch up.
Yeah, we're not going to do that if nobody asks me to, but, if you really want to see it, let me know. And I honestly don't think anybody will, but you never know. I'll take what anybody brings. As with most other apologists, I'm not a fan of testifying. I don't think anybody else is either. I can honestly say that I have never, or at least I don't remember anybody ever asking me, hey, would you go out and do some more Erik Manning? So if you really want to hear more of this, let me know down in the comments and I'll think about it. But watch this video first before you decide, because pretty obviously you're just going to get more of the same.
This first coincidence may be subtle, but it's a real eye-opener. In 1 Samuel 13:19, we discover that as the Philistines grew in power over the Israelites, they forbade Hebrew blacksmiths from operating, preventing the Israelites from making their own weapons. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll notice several casual mentions in other Old Testament historical books that reinforce this very scenario.
And you notice he's just insisting that they are historical, right? Now, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, and this is a very mundane claim that, for all I know, actually did happen, because it has absolutely nothing to do with any gods. Nothing supernatural was involved. It's no more important than London appearing in Harry Potter, so honestly, what difference does it make? Because here's another thing that the religious want to do. They want to assume that if you can find anything that's real in their book of fantasy, that means that absolutely everything else is real too. But that is not how that works. That's really what I figure he's trying to do with this whole series, and that is not remotely impressive. My book says a thing means nothing. Just because your book gets one thing right, that says absolutely nothing about getting anything else right. Every single claim bears its own burden of proof. So color me completely unimpressed with his first claim. So what? Following a conquest, keeping the people from making weapons to rebel is pretty common. Whoop-de-doo. Hopefully it gets better from here, but I wouldn't be betting on it.
For instance, the same passage mentions how Hebrews had to rely on the Philistines to sharpen their farming tools. Then, in Judges 3:16, we see Ehud concealing a homemade dagger by strapping it to his right leg since he was left-handed. This would basically be like somebody making a shank while they were in prison. Ehud had to sneak around to forge it.
Like I said, big deal. What does that have to do with a god? That's what we have to get back to here, because I think it's painfully obvious that's really what he's after. A lot of apologists pull this, and it's no more impressive here. Oh, look at this one thing. So that means that thing over there is real too. No, it doesn't. Any skeptic would point that out, just as I'm doing, but he's not making videos for skeptics, is he? He only wants the people who are desperate to believe because, as I keep pointing out, they don't ask any of the difficult questions that someone like Erik would have a real problem coming up with rational answers for, because Erik isn't a rational person. So his first example is both irrelevant and unimpressive. Got anything else? This is just not going to accomplish what you desperately want it to. Not that I really think you care.
Then in Judges 3:31, Shamgar takes down the Philistines not with a sword, but with an ox goad. And then we look over at Judges 14:5-6, Samson, despite his intentions against the Philistines, finds himself unarmed when he confronts a lion, having to use his bare hands to defend himself. Later in his conflict with the Philistines, Samson resorts to using a donkey jawbone to fight. And who could forget the classic Sunday school tale of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17?
All right. This is just going on way too long for a point that doesn't prove anything. In the future, if he goes on for more than an example or two, I'm just going to fast forward through it because it doesn't actually mean anything. Okay, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I grant you that the Israelites didn't have metal weapons. Their blacksmiths were outlawed. So what? How does that get you to a god? Because if you're not getting to a god, then what the hell is the point of all this? This is like looking at the architecture of King's Cross Station in the Harry Potter books as evidence that Hogwarts exists. It gets you absolutely nowhere. So let's fast forward to his second example, which hopefully won't be that long.
It's not like they intentionally crafted a setup in Judges to neatly clarify a point in 1 Samuel.
For the sake of argument, which is really all I can do here, I will grant you that the Israelites had their blacksmiths banned. So what? Who cares? Again, how does that prove anything other than that this is a story that circulated among the people and others who were aware of these verbal tales just expounded on it? That can happen whether the event happened or not, just as it most likely did in the New Testament. In absolutely no instance does it actually get you to the point where you can conclude that a God exists, which, if that's not the point of all this, you're just wasting your time on historical trivia. Big deal.
And when it comes to David's sling skills, it's not explicitly stated in the earlier passage about the Philistines banning Hebrew blacksmiths. It's like these puzzle pieces that just fell into place without any one person orchestrating the puzzle.
But it still doesn't matter since you are no closer to demonstrating anything worthwhile. It's like those puzzles that are all the same shape and the same color. You can put them together in any order you want since they all fit together any way you can do it, and they all look the same anyway. What have you accomplished? Absolutely nothing. There seems to be no bigger picture being crafted here other than the bald assertion that if one thing is true, then all things are true. And that is, as we know, laughably false. That's why he's not talking to us, because we'll just laugh in his face. Sure, though, I guess if you want to do a Bible study and show how utterly mundane ideas play out through the story, go ahead. Go for it. I don't care. That's really boring. Saying, well, David used a sling because nobody had any metal weapons, that's not really convincing. It says absolutely nothing about a lack of other weapons, and it's a stretch to say that he used the sling specifically because he couldn't have used anything else. Instead of, well, a shepherd would only need weapons to scare away predators, and a sling would do that just fine. He's reading into the text things that simply do not appear because he's looking for a consistent narrative throughout that may or may not even exist. There are other possibilities that he just doesn't want to address because he's got an agenda in mind. What the hell else is new?
All right, let's talk a little bit more about David and Goliath, And here's another one of those sneaky undesigned coincidences. So where exactly did Goliath call home? According to 1 Samuel 17:4, Goliath was none other than Goliath of Gath. Now, let's hop back a bit to Numbers 13:32 through 33.
All right, we're not going to play Bible verse bingo, and honestly, does any of this really matter? As I said before, even if there was a David and the reports of Goliath were just exaggerated, does that actually prove that any of the supernatural parts of the Bible are true? Because it's not at all uncommon for people, especially ancient people, to have myths about particular places. Even more recently, we have stories of monsters and sea serpents in the 1600s and beyond. We have tales of sea captains and explorers fighting sea monsters in those areas. Did it ever happen? Well, almost certainly no. It was just events being blown out of proportion and stories that got exaggerated over time, but this has been going on since time immemorial. It doesn't mean that Goliath, if there ever was a Goliath, was an actual giant. Of course, Erik just assumes that just because it's in the Bible, it must be true, but that's not true, is it? He wouldn't believe the old tale of, say, St. Brendan, who supposedly landed on the back of a gigantic creature called the Gisconius in 1621. Why? Because it doesn't fit in with his mythology. So we'll just skip through the Bible verse since it doesn't matter anyhow and doesn't actually prove anything. Hopefully, he'll have something of substance on the other side, but I wouldn't be holding my breath.
Remember the Israelites chickening out about taking the land after spying it out? Yeah, they backed off because they spotted the sons of Anak, those giants, or as they call them, the Nephilim.
Okay, maybe he's not going to read it fast forwarding averted. I figured he would. Sometimes I'm wrong. There you go. Anyhow, so what? Because we can find all kinds of fanciful stories of monsters even in recent history. We can go with stories of the Loch Ness Monster and things like that, but let's keep it a little closer to home. In just the US alone, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of reported lake monsters all over the place. From the Alkali Lake Monster in Nebraska, to Bessie in Lake Erie, to Kipsey, the sea serpent that supposedly lives in the Hudson River. Would Erik believe that any of those things existed just because they're written about in books? I highly doubt it. This is why these people are such hypocrites, because they believe things inconsistently. If it's in the Bible, it's A-okay. Anywhere else, and they're just gonna at least be skeptical, if not just actively disbelieving it because what the hell. They really should be skeptical of all of it, but they never are they? I wonder why.
They said that they felt like grasshoppers next to these towering figures. Now, swing on over to Joshua 11:21 through 22. The initial generation of scaredy cats didn't make it into the promised land, but Joshua and his crew did, mostly. Yet, there were still some descendants of Anak hanging around, as the passage reads, and Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain.
So, folktales. So what? Of course, he's only making the video to appeal to people predisposed to accept all of this on faith. They're not going to ask those difficult questions that they really ought to be asking that any worthwhile skeptic should. So why should anybody care about his fairy tales? I don't know, you tell me. Because this is what apologists do. They appeal to people who are already faithful to keep them believing in their faith, because those are the people that give the apologists money. It's kind of self-serving, isn't it? Let me reinforce the things you already believe, so you reward me for making you happy. Yeah, okay, sure, whatever you say. But that's not how rational people work. But for the religious, they just don't care, do they?
Aha! So, according to the writer of Joshua, there were still some of those towering Anakim hanging around, especially in Gath. But here's the kicker. The writer of Samuel doesn't make a big deal out of it. They just casually drop the detail that Goliath hailed from Gath.
Which doesn't prove anything any more than Paul Bunyan supposedly being born in Bangor, Maine, among other places, matters. Does that make Paul Bunyan, the giant, real? Of course not. That's how folk tales work, and that's something that Erik doesn't seem to understand. Lots of mythic characters have supposedly real places that they came from. Rip Van Winkle was supposedly born in a small village at the foot of the Catskill Mountains. That doesn't mean that he was real. That doesn't mean he slept for how many ever years he slept for. This is what happens when you give up intellect for blind faith, as the religious have clearly done. It makes you believe really stupid crap. It would be one thing if Erik was presenting this as mythology, but he's not. He's pretending that any of this is legitimate fact. And he's just wrong.
It's like they're not even trying to make connections or fill in the gaps. These sources aren't nudging each other or complementing some grand narrative puzzle. Heck, most folks might not even catch on to this sneaky little coincidence, which wouldn't exactly be helpful for someone who's trying to pull off a fictional story.
That is not how fictional stories work. In fact, what we're looking at here most likely is a folktale. It's stories that people tell each other over a long period of time, and those stories grow and change and evolve as the people do. It probably was never based on anything real, or if it was a tiny little kernel of truth that blew up into something massive in the end, for the same reason that the sea serpent stories weren't. Explorers and pirates told stories to keep people away from their treasure or to warn others of dangerous seas or things like that. They'd see things out in the middle of nowhere, and those things became stories, told around the proverbial campfire, since probably having an actual campfire on a wooden ship, it's not really a good idea, but those stories always change in the retelling. Yet Erik here, he just fell for it hook, line, and sinker. He actually thinks this stuff is real. In fact, he thinks the people retelling these old stories somehow makes them more reliable. Yeah. You got some serious problems, pal. I don't know what to tell you.
So those are just a couple of Old Testament undesigned coincidences for you, and this is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg, really. But hold on tight because there's more waiting for you in the wings. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and make sure you swing back for the next episode where we'll go into more examples. And thanks so much for watching.
Yeah, something tells me I don't think we're going to be back. This is what happens when people are ridiculously credulous, and that does describe Erik, which is one reason I don't do a lot of his videos. But he's really no worse than a lot of other apologists who are all effectively doing the same thing. They don't care if any of this is real. I'd like to think they can't possibly be this dumb, but, we've watched a lot on this channel and you never really know, right? This is where we have to be saying, you can't be serious, but a lot of them are. I'm sure there are the complete con men who don't buy into any of it and they're just trying to make a buck, but mostly I think they at least pay some kind of lip service to these things and believe at least some portion of it, and that's the really sad part, isn't it? These people are so dumb that they don't even know how dumb they are. Don't be like these people. Be better. So anyway, what do you think about all of this? Would you fall for any of these ridiculous stories, or can you see the parallels just as clearly as I can? Let me know that down in the comments. When I read the Bible, and it's not just the Bible, lots of books of mythology are the same way. They tell absurd stories that might have been comforting to the ignorant way back in antiquity. But now, we ought to know better. Granted, these people aren't thinking about these books. They're just feeling. And that's the problem. They don't know how to rationally evaluate their beliefs, and they just don't care. Like I said, don't do that. It's pathetic and stupid. But then again, pathetic and stupid kind of describes Erik Manning, doesn't it? Erik and a lot of other apologists on YouTube, it describes them to a T. Don't be pathetic. Don't be stupid. Have a brain in your head. Examine things skeptically. Don't just believe things just for the sake of believing them. Think about it. Be better. Because if you really think about it, it's kind of hard to be worse.